So the first step, and this one actually sounds simple, but it's hilarious how hard this can be, is that you got to lay out the customer journey. What are the steps in your sales model? Could be sales-led, could be marketing-led, could be product-led. So let's give you an example. Like sales-led, this was Mobile Iron. Basically, marketing generated leads, we qualified them, and then handed off to sales. And sales did a first meeting, we then did a second meeting. We pushed the customer to do an evaluation, we had an executive meeting, and then a decision win. Got it, pretty straightforward. Well, if you're doing a marketing-led model, essentially you do digital marketing, you push people to a webinar, and then you try and get them to do a free trial, and you drive usage based on that free trial. And then based on the analytics, inside sales calls them. They get a purchase commit, and then very importantly, how do you onboard them, get to production, do an upsell, and renew? Or if it's a product-led, like a Twilio or a SendGrid, the digital marketing pushes everybody to the website, they do a free trial, they get the usage, they buy with a credit card, and they expand. Now, every company, every company needs to figure out what your customer journey looks like. But there's a really important part of this to get right that is a common mistake, which is the journey has to represent the actual physics of your customer journey, not the stages that Salesforce.com comes pre-programmed with for forecasting. How many of you use the 7 stages that Salesforce comes with that are 20%, 40%, 50%, 70%, 80%, 100% forecast? That's not this. You really have to kind of blur your eyes and abstract away because this has nothing to do with forecasting. And by the way, nobody ever uses the weighted average forecasting stuff in Salesforce anyway. So the important thing is to blur your eyes and really understand what the physics of the customer journey is. And just getting your leaders on board with what does that journey look like, what are the major steps of that customer journey, sounds simple, but you'll be surprised that you'll be about 75% the same and 25% different. And it's really important that you nail down that 25% that's different. Because otherwise, the company doesn't know what to do. Yeah, you had a question there.
So, would you say the 3 models are somewhat related to product complexity and deal size?
So the question was, are the 3 models related to product complexity and deal size? The answer is yes, but I actually, in my thesis, and this is just a Bob Tinker thesis, is those are the symptom, and the real thing is how the customer makes the decision. Because you could have a small deal size with a complex product, but if for some reason you can sell it really easily, pick the sales model that matches how the customer makes a decision. They're correlated. If it's a big ticket, it tends to be a more complicated decision. If it's a small ticket, it tends to be an easier decision. So I find people look for the concrete aspects of your product and pricing to make a decision, but I think it's more important to get down to the psychology of how the customer actually makes the decision, because sometimes you can get a missed signal in there. But that's a great question, actually. Great question. Okay, so now, imagine you've got this whiteboard in your conference room, and we're going to do one of these in a little bit, actually. Imagine in your conference room where you've got the stages of your sales journey laid out across the top that are not your Salesforce forecasting stages. Now, the next thing is, what do people do and say at each stage? What do people do and say at each stage? And what's the wow? And I'll talk a little bit more about what the wow is in a second. So again, this sounds relatively simple, but you'd be surprised. Grab your head of marketing, head of product, and whoever's leading sales and say, all right, go up to the whiteboard and write this. You'll get 50% the same, 50% different, because everybody's got a slightly different version of reality in their brain. The company I was talking about earlier, this is what took them 4 months to get this nailed down. So I'm actually going to unblur that and show you what the real things were that were on our Mobile Iron go-to-market playbook. So getting these right requires sacrifice and distillation, because there's lots of things you could say. What are the 3 things you're going to say? There's lots of things that could happen in a first meeting. What are the 3 things that must happen? So at Mobile Iron, at the front end, we basically hooked customers and got their attention with 3 things. Hey, do you have mobile devices and apps? Yes. Good. Hey, are users struggling with bring your own device? Little backstory in Mobile Iron, we invented the bring your own device concept. Customers were struggling with that, so that was a hook to get their attention. And the third thing was, hey, are you worried about security of your data that's moving out to mobile? There are lots of other things we could have talked about, but those were sort of the 3 hooks that we got them in initially. The question is, then what did we do? We drove them to a first meeting. That first meeting was typically a WebEx. Sometimes it was an in-person meeting. It was typically a WebEx, where we'd explore their needs, talk about what we did. This is where we had the first pitch PowerPoint deck. We talk about how innovative we are. And then we'd have an ask, which is, we'd like to do a deep dive. So we actually had a second meeting. Very rarely could we go from first meeting to eval. We typically had to have a second meeting because it was a relatively new product category where customers needed education. Then we pushed customers to eval. We'd turn them up with a live instance. We'd give them a test plan to go do. Now, interestingly, this is a spot where we struggled, because what we found is customers didn't know what to do during an eval. Customers literally would do like a left to right user interface tour. That's how they do an eval. Well, let me just click on things, left to right. Did that work or not work? So we realized is we actually had to give them an evaluation guide, which is test these 10 things, and if they're green boxes, you pass the eval. What was also really interesting about that is that getting to what those 10 things are that you want to test during the eval, and to make sure the product did a good job of that, and the product actually was easier to use to be able to do that, and we stuck a couple competitive traps in there to blow up our competition, like that part of the sales playbook became a really important, very dynamic part of our engagement with customers. Then after the eval, we'd say, we'd like to present the results to your executive. So we'd like to make sure we have an executive meeting, then we get the decision and have the win. So this was sort of what people did and say at each stage. Well, this can sort of make people get bored, because there's lots of things you could say, there's lots of things you could do. How do you sort of figure out what the things are to really pay attention to?